Nixon had actually lasted for 45 issues and then went out of business. Because, as Daniel Defoe said, everybody depends on advertisements. You cannot do it without. And we'll see that again. In fact, you saw that when we looked at the piece from The Spectator about the coffee house and all the advertisements in the coffee house. But those magazines themselves were full of advertisements, and we'll see some of that. One of the things that comes up and creates an interesting alliance is that, as they refer to there, advertisements for medicines become particularly important at this era. At first, the first few advertisements you get in the 16th and 17th century are for books, and we'll ask why later, but very quickly by the 18th century, 40%, 50% of advertisements are for things that make you healthy. And so if you want to introduce the country to this strange new drink, which we didn't know about before, called coffee, you don't say it tastes good, you say you actually take it because it's good for your health. It's wholesome, a physical drink, having excellent virtues, it closes the orifice of the stomach, I would ask about that, fortifies the heat within, helps with digestion, quickens the spirits, makes the heart light, and is good against eyesores, cold, cough, rheumatoid consumption, headache, dropsy, gout, scurvy, king's evil, and miscarrying. It'll just cure everything. So you want someone to drink a cup of coffee? Well, you tell them that it's absolutely essential. And one of the odd things, again, is that not only through advertising, but back to the early days of almanacs, which we've also talked about for a while and on, you start to get these financial alliances in that publishers, particularly of almanacs, but even of newspapers and books, start also to become either the sellers of or the inventors of different kinds of medical preparation. An awful lot of the early newspapers were actually people who were, in one way or another, and this raises all those questions again about the Royal Society, because some of them are also members of the Royal Society, selling their own hack medicines about in order to support their newspaper. And so not just advertisements in general, but these specific advertisements. And that, again, brings us to the New York Times this morning, which opens its science section with a very long article about the New England Journal of Medicine, still trying to lead this battle between making profits out of medicine and doing scientific research into medicine. So again, it's a very contemporary battle, but it has long roots. The more general question of sealing off that wall between advertising on the one hand and editorial copy on the other is pervasive. And if you ever read any of these things, one problem with reading individual articles online is you may not look through the whole issue. But here is The Spectator, which people hold up as the most noble and high-minded of early periodicals. It sort of set the example for these great men like Addison and Johnson Swift to write high-minded essays that we still read 300 years later. So here's an example. What they often did in the newspaper was that they would, and Blake again talked about this, that they would send in, they would have fake letters that they would print, which they claimed came from somebody else, but they would really write them themselves. So here, dear Mr. Spectator, several of my friends this morning got together over a dish of tea in very good health, even though we'd celebrated yesterday with more glasses than we could have dispensed with, and had we not been beholden to Brooks and Hellyer. So what it's saying is we felt really good this morning over our cup of tea, and we weren't hungover because the wine we drank last night was incredibly good wine. And I feel, I should tell the world that this really good wine company is out there and people should use it. What it doesn't tell you, of course, is that Brooks and Hellyer advertises in The Spectator and supports The Spectator, and this is simply puffed copy, but masquerading as editorial copy. Daniel Defoe, who also published at the time, and in fact had a history, he had been a wine merchant himself, so he used his own authority to say, look, I know that most of the wine in London is junk, but let me tell you that there is this company called Brooks and Hellyer, and they really can be relied on. And of course, when you look in the next issue, what you see in the back is another advertisement by Brooks and Hellyer. Now, most of you probably aren't shocked by this, but I, as a sweet and innocent soul, came to America 30 years ago and lived in St. Louis, and I remember listening to the baseball games and hearing these guys, Jack Buck, talking about the baseball game and saying, I had a really good meal last night at such and such a restaurant. And I thought, wow, that's just amazing. He tells you, not knowing that these people were paid through the nose to slip these things into their commentary. But nowadays, of course, it's just standard. And the assumption, in fact, that in many ways this is as much the role of the press as putting news out becomes evident when you look at some of the big newspapers that developed in London across the 18th century. The Daily Advertiser, in fact, was possibly put together by a bunch of coffee houses who saw that everybody there was reading the newspaper and they weren't making any money out of it, particularly out of the advertisements. So they created a paper and quite nakedly called it the Daily Advertiser. And then there was others. There was the General Advertiser, the London Advertiser, the Public Advertiser, the Morning Post and Daily Advertiser, which was the agglomeration. And that one, Stanley Morrison, one of the great historians of typography, and the man who also gave us Times New Roman as a typeface, he pointed out that, that with that last paper, the Morning Post and Advertiser, you more or less got what looked like the newspaper and became a fixed form well into the 20th century. The London Times didn't stop having advertisements on its front page until about the 1960s. So this just became the standard format to newspapers, to lead with advertisements on the front page until quite late on. Of course, then all the questions return again. Well, what if this business is driven by advertising? You look at Horace Greeley, who we talked about before with the Tribune, he's pretty open about it. He said, we lose money on our circulation by itself considered, but with 20,000 subscribers, we can command such advertising and such prices for it as will render our enterprise a remunerating one. So look, we can basically, as the adage goes, we can sell our readers to advertisers. That's what we're doing. That's the way around. And this becomes a model for a great deal of the discourse in the public sphere, as we know up until today. But as new technologies comes along, that claim that the Gazette made starts to recur. Herbert Hoover, looking at the radio when it comes along, says it's inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility for service to be drowned in advertising chatter. Well, we know what happened to that great hope. The radio will never carry any advertisements. Harold Innis, the historian of communication, makes the interesting point that probably the founding of the BBC was done by the government in a way to offset the power of the commercial press with its advertising. And so it was a deliberate attempt to give the government a voice that wasn't crowded out by a commercial voice. And so very early on, John Reith, who is more or less the founder of the BBC, came up with some enormously high-minded comment where he says, somebody introduced Christianity into England and somebody introduced smallpox, bubonic plague, and the Black Death. Somebody is minded now to introduce sponsored broadcasting. We need to be ashamed of moral values or intellectual and ethical objectives. It is these that are here and now and at stake. So look, bringing the radio in was like introducing Christianity, but bringing in advertising would be like introducing the bubonic plague, and he was not going to have it. And of course, the BBC in the UK still broadcasts without advertisements, though if you go online here, you will see that it's starting to produce advertisements for its online presence overseas. Inside, it's paid by license. And when we get to the radio and broadcast, we'll talk more about that. So this question again is, what does advertising do to your mission? Does it corrupt it? From very early on, but also late on, is deep in how people ask questions about new technologies and they come along. So for instance, when you look, as we were at the question of search, someone wrote in 1999, I think, about the growth of web servers and the need for search engines to be able to understand the web. But search engines, it says, have migrated from the academic domain to the commercial. Up until now, most search engine development has gone on at companies with little publication of the details. So we don't know what they're doing. It's a black art. This causes search engine technology to remain largely a black art and to be advertising oriented. So it's really corrupting search because it's wrapped around the idea of advertising. And so we have a strong goal to push, and this sounds like Lord Rees, to push more development and understanding into the academic realm. Because here in academia, at least we can be honest about what we're doing and what we're up to. Anyone know who said that? Two very recognizable figures, the founders of Google. So that rather high-minded sentiment about what advertising does to search, within 3 years had disappeared almost entirely. And the idea of a black box, that it was nasty, that it corrupted search, sort of went away. But early on, they too were fairly clear that that was a real problem for search, that if search was driven by the need for advertisement, it was going to corrupt search itself. Some of you will probably have seen, I imagine, this letter that appeared this week in the New York Times. In fact, it was turned into an editorial, where a relatively senior figure at Goldman Sachs resigned, saying that Goldman Sachs was basically corrupt and was ripping off its customers. Most of you see that? One of the strange things about it was that it obscured what I think otherwise would have got much wider presence. There was a very senior figure at Google, leaving them to go to the devil itself, to Microsoft, and saying that the reason he left is that the Google I was passionate about was a technology company that empowered its employees to innovate. The Google I left was an advertising company with a single corporate mandated focus. So all the way back to the Gazette, again, of 1668, and right now up to this week, these questions: what does advertising do? How many people actually saw this story? So a few of you did. It's surprising to me how little play it got, and I think partly the big Goldman Sachs story. And in fact, as we look at these various things, we see them starting to be questions about, are they honest? There's this story from last year from Yelp, of someone from Yelp calling up and saying, we see you've got some bad comments in Yelp about your business, but actually if you put an advertisement on Yelp, we might be able to help those go away. Questions about Google infringement on privacy, it's dealing with Safari and hacking around to Safari to take information that you've asked it not to tell. Groupon and its practices seeming to be dodgier and dodgier. So all the while, the technology on which we depend, the infrastructure that we're based on, is, at least in principle, a threat of corruption from the very means that we rely on to pay it. So these questions, as I say, go back from the very beginnings of modern print advertising, but they're still here today. We haven't managed to get rid of them. Raises the question in some ways about, well, so what is really new in this business? How much has changed and how much hasn't? How much is perennial? One of the first advertisements that anybody has tracked down is this delicate little poem from Greece, actually. This is the translation. For eyes that are shining, for cheeks like the dawn, for beauty that lasts after girlhood has gone, for prices in reason, the woman who knows will buy her cosmetics from Ascalipto. So here we have a primeval advertisement. What are its strategies? Just what does it do? How does it try to, other than get its name out of what it should do? What else does it do to sell? Is it just informing that you can buy something in Ascalipto? Yeah. It promises a better future. Okay, things are going to, not just things are going to look good, but you're going to look good in the future. Yeah. Through, right, so by how, because, so your cheeks like the dawn? Right, we all want cheeks like the dawn, those rosy dawn cheeks? Yeah. Right, I mean, that's quite clever. It starts to look, address it, say that, you'll be sophisticated if you buy this stuff, and people, it's the woman who knows, who knows. Yeah, right. Now, nostalgia, is that only nostalgia, would you say? Yeah. Right. I mean, nostalgia is one word for it. Right. It gets at your anxieties. My God, has my beauty gone? Is it about to fade? Will it go? So even if you hadn't thought about this before because you felt your complexion was fine, it's starting to say, think twice about it. It's going to go soon, so you better start buying or know about Ascalipto. So here are tactics that are pervasive throughout modern advertising, promising the world. Johnson, in an article in the Idler, had a nice bit about the vendor of beautifying fluid, confesses it will not restore the bloom of 15 to a lady of 50, and so has this kind of spurious honesty. But in that suggests that for anybody else, it will make you look as if you have a complexion of a 15-year-old. And, of course, there are modern corollaries of that, and some of you probably saw the brouhaha. In fact, the attempt to say that if you're actually claiming to show photographs, and this goes back to the photography class, claiming to show photographs of what cosmetics have done, you cannot use touch-up on those photographs. They have to be honest photographs, and it's becoming a big question of advertising standards. And similarly, women are talking for bans on advertisements, particularly those that are touched up for cosmetic surgery of one sort or another. So many of the strategies that we see today are old but really enduring because they tell us something less about the technology than they do about the human condition and our anxiety. And that's kind of an underlying theme for many of our thoughts about technological determinism, that if we look at machines to change us, on the other hand, we must remember how many enduring aspects of human nature there seem to be that last a lot longer than technologies. We start to see very quickly with print advertisements coming in. Probably the first in English identifiable print is an advertisement for the Pies of Salisbury, which sounds like an advertisement for food. It's not. It's actually for a publication. Pies were a kind of supplication or prayer from Salisbury Cathedral. And they appear, William Caxton, who was generally credited with starting print in England, brings it in about 1475, and 2 years later, he has this in the back of one of his books. And as I said, up until the 18th century, when medicine starts to take over and just accelerates away, it's mostly advertisements for books that appear both in the back of books, but also in magazines or periodicals. Why would that be? Any thoughts? Why is this the obvious thing to advertise? Pretty close. I mean, it's your own business. You're the printer. And if you think, you're setting this type, someone has given you the copy for a periodical, and you're setting it in letters, you're not quite sure how long it'll take, or you're setting up a whole book, you have a gap at the end. Well, what do you do with that gap? Well, you want to stick something in it. Well, you're going to advertise. Well, if you haven't got an advertising industry, an advertising salesman, what are you going to do? Well, you advertise one of the other books that you've got in your shop that isn't selling. So early on, advertising was simply a matter of filling up space and saying, look, if you like this book, you probably like something else that I've printed as well. Obviously, it develops and it changes. We've looked at them in many ways now, so much so that Johnson, though clearly with tongue-in-cheek, was able to say in the middle of the 18th century, advertising is near perfection now. And if you read that article, the strategies that he describes, which I've seeded through the various lectures, various slides here, are ones that are still familiar today. He knew, what was going on and how, but he has a little joke. Well, look, it's near perfection. He said we can't really imagine how it's going to change, so what we need to do is question some of the moral assumptions about whether it's right or whether it's wrong. He talks in that about the magnificence of promise, that what we have to do is make more and more extravagant claims, whether it's for beauty cream or sharpening razors, that your face will become perfect and heroic. One of the most extraordinary advertising ventures of the time, and if you look through newspapers of the period, was the extraordinary Dr. Graham's celestial bed, which claimed that if you made love in his electric bed, you would almost automatically have children, and that this was a new method of fertility. And he sold it in a very high-minded way for infertile couples. In fact, it became a kind of kinky sex practice, partly because while you lay in the celestial bed, he was actually just behind you with this enormous hand crank sending electric shocks through the bed that you lay on. So there was a kind of weird voyeurism, and it said that carriages, with their windows closed so you couldn't see what was in them, were lined up outside his shop to go. The question of whether anybody did or didn't have children from sleeping in is a different question, but as an extraordinary advertising campaign, his claim that he was a doctor as well. In fact, he experimented in electricity. He came to the States, like all failed Englishmen. He first attempted to be a scientist in England and couldn't work out, and the failures come over here and teach. But he came back and got a job. But got this job, in fact, as a sort of shaman, claiming that Ben Franklin was indeed behind this great. But at the center of the period, you should have seen and read about, is the remarkable figure Wedgwood. Now, we've met the Wedgwoods several times. This pottery firm in the middle of England, but they came in when we talked about the clock, because it was one of the first places, one of the first factories, Eritrea, that had a punch clock. They were pioneers in photography. They were pioneers in duplicating technology and carbon paper. But they were also extraordinary pioneers, Josiah Wedgwood, in marketing. He developed pottery, which is still, although in fact the company has recently gone into bankruptcy, having survived for 250 years. But he was brilliant in many ways at modern strategies of marketing. And this sort of famous picture, which is by a great artist, Stubbs, one of the things he did was he persuaded artists to, when they were painting, to put in the background of grand families a couple of Wedgwood plates. And although it's hard to see in this one, in fact, there, you can't see it, I'm afraid, in this reproduction. There's a little Wedgwood pot there that Stubbs was painting. And if you look at Wedgwood, what he is remarkable is for what I think you could identify as modern marketing techniques. He, again, is a refutation of standard accounts that say, well, he had better technology. Kendrick suggests he didn't. He had lower prices. He didn't. He had better quality goods. He didn't. All of those things was very fierce competition on. But what he was really good at was working out how to sell things. And you can see the sort of lifestyle moves that we still recognize today emerge in many ways with Wedgwood. So he thought of product placement, as in that photograph, that image of a painting, and in many other paintings. He saw it was absolutely vital to have the aristocracy appear with his goods. And of course, that's the strategy that is now prevalent throughout technology. Get your technology out looking innocently in the background of something else that is going on. Well, he began that. He had a warehouse in London, and people began to go to his warehouse, and he realized that what he should do is he should turn it into a store. And having got one important store in London which got a lot of business, and people were seen to come and go, and he would encourage and tempt high-value clients in so others would see them coming and they would go too. He then had a chain of stores around England, all of which were very, very carefully designed inside, so people would, both on the one hand, see the high-priced goods at the top, but also could go downstairs and find the lower-priced goods that they could buy, so he appealed across classes. And of course, that's a strategy that we know as well, that when we look at the Apple Store, which is now meant to be one of the premium tourist sites in all of New York, it was a strategy that was anticipated by Wedgwood, and he made the Wedgwood Store, initially the warehouse in London, one of the most fashionable places for anybody to go. He was particularly good at courting royalty and making sure that they had in their houses examples of his stuff which he would send them for free, or he would persuade people to give them as gifts, so that when other people went there, oh, the Duchess of so-and-so, or the Duke of so-and-so, or the Prince of so-and-so uses Wedgwood pottery, and would rush out and buy new pieces of Wedgwood pottery. And again, that's the kind of thing that is prevalent in society today, that suddenly we notice what people are doing and wearing, and we buy those things. Well, he was terribly good at doing that. He went global. He saw that it was important for the business to be spread overseas, and he started to take pottery to China, which was a remarkable thing to do. He created ideas of class emulation. He would provide cheaper versions for people lower down the social scale, so that they too could have their Wedgwood and therefore look like the Duke and Duchess higher up above. He invented self-service. His stores were self-service, not done before, and in fact, in most stores, not done for another 100 years or so. We see it, people like Wanamaker in the 19th century are doing this, but in fact, he did that. He thought of free postage. Everybody said, well, Amazon, early on it decided that it should, for a certain price you should get free postage. He decided that was a very good idea. And of course, in advertising, he thought of the puff, of the idea that you could get people to write about you in the newspapers in the non-advertising columns was much more valuable than it was to have people absolutely advertising on your behalf. And so he learned very quickly how to get puffs into the press. And in fact, there was, as McKendrick talks about, a journal called, or a newspaper called Anti-Puffado, which made fun of these puffs. But he realized that even an anti-puffado mention could be good for you, that there's no such thing as bad publicity. So for 1770s, 1780s, he and his partner Bentley as well, actually remarkable account of how many of the modern advertising strategies they anticipated. And they were moving into a very heavily advertised world. What Naomi Klein starts to talk about as the branded world. By the 19th century, it wasn't unlikely to see walls and hoardings, any space that was left available for attack, just covered with advertising of one sort or another. And these figures called bill posters who went around with their long brushes. In those days, you didn't have to buy advertising hoardings, you just found a spare bit of wall. Those of you in the history department, I know David Henkin writes wonderfully about this. So the world is starting in a way both to be run by advertising and to accommodate advertising. People just expect it everywhere. One thing that I shift